and get started with the meeting. And so I'm going to call on Tony. Tony is going to give us the thought for the month.
All right, good morning. As we meet this morning in a post-election, painfully divided nation, I'm going to talk about peace and how women are good at it. Last month, the United Nations Security Council marked the 20-year anniversary of Resolution 1325, which acknowledged the essential role of women in securing and maintaining peace. If you want to reduce conflict and advance stability, you need to include women in peace processes. Instead, women are often excluded from formal peace processes. Between 1992 and 2019, women constituted on average 6% of signatories in major peace processes around the world. And of course, the point of this is that we need more women to be world leaders. And I wrote this a little bit ago, but as of this morning, the United States has its very first woman vice president-elect. So there's an element of this that is out of date. They need us. When women are at the negotiating table, peace agreements are more likely to last 15 years or longer. When at least 35% of a country's legislature are women, the risk of conflict relapse is close to zero. The participation of women's organizations like AAUW makes a peace agreement 64% less likely to fail. The longer a country has had female suffrage before the outbreak of an international dispute, the higher the likelihood that it will resolve the dispute without military force. Women's presence in politics restores trust in government and increases the amount of attention paid by political bodies to social welfare, local legal protection, and the transparency of government and business. Women's participation in public sector positions improves the provision of clean water, immunization, schooling, and infrastructure. The most rapid post-conflict reductions in poverty have been in areas where women reported higher levels of empowerment in their households, and on and on. So why? 6 reasons. Number 1, women are more inclined to work across lines. Women often take a collaborative approach to peacemaking and organize across cultural and sectarian divides. Women typically incorporate the concerns of diverse demographics like religions, ethnic and cultural groups. This approach reduces failure, conflict, and poverty. Number 2, women act as honest brokers. Including women at the peace table increases the likelihood of reaching an agreement because women are often viewed as honest brokers. This perception is because women often operate outside existing power structures and are more widely perceived to be politically impartial mediators. Number 3, women stage mass action. Women often employ visible and high-profile tactics to pressure parties to begin or recommit to peace negotiations, as well as to sign accords. Women's groups have successfully staged mass actions and mobilized public opinion campaigns in many countries to encourage progress in peace talks. In recent times, women's groups have organized more mass action campaigns in support of peace deals than any other group. Number 4, women access critical information. Because women tend to have different social roles and responsibilities than men do, they have access to information and community networks that can inform negotiating positions and areas of agreement. Number 5, women broaden the agenda. Women are more likely to raise social issues in negotiations that help societies reconcile and recover. Women raise issues in conflict resolution processes beyond military action, power sharing arrangements, and territorial gains, instead introducing political and legal reforms and social and economic recovery priorities that make agreements more durable. And finally, number 6, women aid post-conflict recovery. Monitoring disarmament and demobilization, establishing a truth and reconciliation process, and drafting a constitution are all more effective when women participate. Women are also more likely to direct post-conflict resources to the reconstruction of public institutions and services critical to long-term stability, like schools, healthcare services, clean drinking water, and judicial systems. So to my AAUW sisters and our guests, thank you for the peace that you create and keep. Where did Sue go? I could keep going, you know.
Well, I'm up next. Should I go ahead and do that? Okay. I am so happy and privileged this morning to be introducing this month's speaker, Marbury Staley Butts. Because we are AAUW and we care about education, it is important to us that Marbury is a graduate of Redlands High School. She then attended Columbia University, majoring in African American Studies and Human Rights, graduating summa cum laude. Next, Marbury received a full ride scholarship to Oxford University, where she graduated with distinction in African American Studies. She then went on to graduate from Yale Law School. Marbury is now the Executive Director of Law for Black Lives, and she works closely with organizers, lawyers, and legal advocates to build a responsible legal infrastructure for movement organizations and to advance and actualize radical policy. Marbury is a founding member of the National Bailout Collective, the organization behind Free Black Mamas movement. She also was a founding member of the Movement for Black Lives Matter policy table and helped develop the Vision for Black Lives policy platform. Marbury was appointed to by the New York City Council to the NYPD Complaint Review Board in 2017 and continues to serve. The second wave of feminism brought significant gains for white and middle class women, but for Black, brown, poor, and queer women, gains were often erased. She will be using hashtag #FreeBlackMamas as a case study to explain the ways the criminal legal system targets Black and queer women and the work of the National Bailout Collective to address these injustices. Today, Marbury will also be discussing the Black Lives Matter movement and the underlying politics that animate the movement, namely abolition and Black queer feminism. Marbury will explore the meaning, vision, and praxis of these two political ideologies, specifically as they manifest the work of the National Bailout Collective. May I now introduce you to Marbury Staley Butts.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think my resume does not say perhaps the most important thing, which is I am Dr. Jodine Staley's daughter as well. And so I'm both incredibly excited and a little bit nervous. I feel like between my mom and Erica Wilson, who's like an aunt to me, being on the call, there's a lot of pressure. So I'm super excited to be here though, and share a bit about my work. I think I take the invitation as a curiosity about the Black Lives Matter movement and the politics that really animate it. And so I'm going to talk a bit about my work inside that I've been incredibly blessed and lucky to be one of the lawyers and legal workers who have been both a thought partner and I think really a defense of this movement when both governments and sheriffs and other people have come forward. And so I'm super excited to share some of that work with y'all. I have a PowerPoint because that's how we do. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let me know if for some reason you can't see it. Can everyone see that okay? Yep, awesome, yes. Thank you. And I also have to say, I think after my mother as well, in perhaps not being 100% on time. So if I go over, please let me know. I come from preachers and teachers. So give me a sign or something just when I have 5 minutes left, and I can make sure to cut it. But let me start the presentation. So I really am taking this as kind of an invitation to help understand the Black Lives Matter movement in some ways, and specifically as it pertains to Black women and queer folks. And I'll do that from kind of a personal lens and talk a bit about myself. And so I want to do a quick introduction of who I am, and then talk about Law for Black Lives, which is my organization that I helped co-found and am now the executive director of, and talk about both the work we do, but I think also the politics that we really try to uphold. And then a bit about the National Bailout of Free Black Mamas campaign, which is a campaign that we incubated and have put really all our blood and sweat into for over 3 years now. And I think that will take us to a conversation about Black queer feminism, which is the animating politic behind both the organization that I run and also the movement around freeing Black mamas. And I would argue more largely the Black Lives Matter movement. And I want to, I guess, kind of have a caveat to say, that there have been this summer and also in 2015, literally tens of thousands of people took to the streets. And they took to the streets because there was a clear systematic devaluing of Black lives in this country. And my organization and organizations that we work with are not representation of everybody who goes into the streets, but I think it's important to know that there really is an active campaign and work to build power in Black communities that's radical. And I'll talk a bit about what radical means. I don't mean kind of the far right radical. I mean, grasping at the roots of all the different systems, whether it's racism, whether it's patriarchy, whether it is capitalism, that are really destroying Black and brown communities and poor communities across the world and in the United States. And so I work with organizations who are building power and have a very specific analysis. And I want to just be clear that although I think that analysis has animated the movement in the streets, then not everybody who is marching shares this analysis, although we are trying to be, preachers, and we hope that more people will share it. So I'm going to start with kind of the context of the founding of Law for Black Lives. So I was one of about 15 lawyers and legal workers of different races who founded Law for Black Lives, which we call L4BL, in 2014. And the context of that, number one, was the killing of Black people. So this is just a short collage. We have Breonna Taylor here. We have Ayanna Stanley Jones, we have Eric Garner, who folks know, we have, of course, Michael Brown, and I'm sure folks remember the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. His body was left out on the street for more than 5 hours for his neighbors to see. It was reminiscent for many of a lynching. Literally, the kind of police had killed him and then left him strung up for his family and his loved ones to see and watch. And I think what it ignited in Black folks across the country was a sense of outrage, a reminder, much like Emmett Till and Rodney King, that this is a country that will kill and devalue Black people. But I think it's important to say that it was not just for that reason that folks took to the streets. In fact, a Black person is killed by the police every 28 hours in this country. And just to repeat that, every 28 hours, a Black person in this country is killed by the police. I think the outrage of that moment went far beyond police killings. It was about all of the different ways in which these systems really fail Black people. And I think more recently, the killing of George Floyd, and there's a beautiful article, I think it's in The Atlantic, although I'll double check and I'll send it to y'all, about all the different systems that actually killed George Floyd. So it's not just the police, it's also the time he spent in prison. It's the lack of availability to healthcare. It's the way that his mother, who was a single mother who lived in the projects, was constantly undermined. And so looking at the ways in which multiple systems at multiple points are failing Black communities. We also were founded, I think, with the backdrop of neoliberal policy. And I'm very excited and relieved, I think today, and the election of Joe Biden is a step back from fascism, and we have to celebrate at every single moment when we are able to step back from fascism. But neoliberalist policies are really policies that people like Joe Biden triumph and really support. And so I think the movement in many ways is responding to what we see as a violent neoliberalist policy. And when I say neoliberalism, I'm referring to the privatization of public good under the guise of liberalism. And so whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, that there is a constant push to privatize things that should be public goods. And the result of that is a really predatory capitalism that often leaves Black and brown people without those services and goods. And so under the 1990s, there was an onset of neoliberalist policies really under both Clinton and under Bush that essentially led to the defunding of the social safety net and the overfunding of prisons and jails. And so that happened both at the federal level, but also the local level. And so what you see on this slide is a map that breaks down how much of different cities' budgets are being spent on policing versus things like transportation, housing, education. And so in a place like Oakland, that's 41% of the general budget is going to policing. And in a place like New York, that's like literally $4 billion a year. In Minneapolis, it's about 35%. And so we can see a correlation between where there is huge amounts of police violence and really deprivation of Black communities and these decisions to defund the social safety net and to fund policing and prison. And so I think when you hear the words defund police, it really stems from this analysis. There has been over 30 years of a bipartisan effort to really cut away the social safety net in favor of and instead has really been funding policing and incarceration. And so L4BL was founded as a rejection of those kinds of policies. I think the other thing that was happening was there was a mythology of kind of a post-racial America. And so we were founded under the Obama administration. There was this idea that like racism is dead, which I think the uprisings and the killings of the last year have made clear was not the case, that a single Black man in power does not mean that racism is over by any means, shape, or form. But I think that was the narrative that folks were fighting against, even as the rates of Black unemployment remained doubled, even as Black children were going hungry at alarming rates in this country. There was this narrative, because Obama was in the White House, that somehow we couldn't be a racist country, and somehow the foundations of racism that this country is built on were solved because of one person in the White House. L4BL was kind of founded on a few assessments. One of those assessments was that the problem was not a surface level problem. And so as we went to Ferguson, as we went to Baltimore, as there were uprisings across the country, we had the analysis that this was not just about policing, that a body camera would not fix this problem. That what was happening was an indictment of the entire system. And I remember, I spent a lot of time in 2015 and 16 at those protests. And I remember talking to an older woman who was in Baltimore actually at a protest and asking her why she was there. And just as a reminder, there was massive uprisings in Baltimore after the killing of Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray was arrested for no reason. He ran from police because police are occupying forces in Baltimore neighborhoods. He ran from police. He was chased down. A small amount of marijuana, I believe, was found on him. He was put in the back of a police truck with no seatbelt on, and then the police truck proceeded to intentionally go back and forth and rock across the road, and he died because of injuries suffered in the back of that police van. And so people took to the streets for days, for weeks actually. And when I asked this older woman why she was there, she didn't mention Freddie Gray. She said, my kids go to a school that has no heat in the wintertime. We have no books. I live in public housing that literally has lead in the walls, and they know it, and they're poisoning my kids, and nobody cares. And there was this sense of, it's not just that the police target and kill our people. It's that every single system, from the housing system to the educational system to the transportation system, it's failing Black neighborhoods, and nobody cares. And so Black Lives Matter resonated because it was so obvious to Black people in these neighborhoods that really the government, the cities, the states, the politicians did not care about their lives, whether it was their lives because the police were chasing them, or it was their children in schools or their healthcare systems. And so every single system in this country was making it so clear to Black people, especially Black women, I think, that that they didn't matter. And so I want to just name that it really was not just police brutality that animates this movement, that animates Law for Black Lives. It's the understanding that all of these systems interact in ways that are very, very, very dangerous for Black people and brown people and poor people. And that it is very obvious to folks who have to survive those systems that these systems don't care about them. We also recognize there was a lack of infrastructure for radical organizations. And so there exists a lot of kind of ACLU organizations who are great, they do important work, but they don't follow the leadership of the folks on the front lines and their politics. We also recognize that the lawyers who were trying to do this work were very isolated, and so wanted to support that. And lastly, and this is a line from Mary Hooks, who we'll talk more about, she's one of the founders of the Free Black Mamas Fellowships, says that we have to be committed to be transformed in the service of the work, that by doing this work, by being involved in social change, you yourself are constantly being challenged to transform. And I think for me, Ferguson was a transformational moment. I often talk about kind of a few moments in my life where my politics were transformed. I was politicized around radical feminism in law school, because law school is a boys club, and it's really problematic. There's a lot of sexual harassment and abuse. So I was radicalized for kind of my feminist politic in law school. And I think Ferguson and this moment radicalized me in terms of race and in terms of feminism. Because what was clear to me as I was in the front lines with young folks, and literally with the apparatus of the military, there were tanks out there. There was tear gas thrown at young Black people who had no weapons, who were using their bodies as a sign of protest. And I remember being there in the middle of the night with tear gas all around us, and realizing that the law wasn't going to save these folks, but also being just struck by how much folks who were in the projects, had never been given a chance in their life, were sacrificing to make a stand around the way that the state was failing them, and how brave that was. And so what that demanded of me as somebody who had a lot of privilege was to stand with them, but also to build infrastructure that would support them in the long run. And so I think this idea, and I want to invite all of y'all into it as well, which is this commitment to be transformed in the service of the work. If you commit yourself to social justice work, then it will transform you, and to welcome that and to be flexible and agile as you're transformed. Ooh. So Law for Black Lives is an organization that adopts a movement lawyering approach. I'll talk a bit about that. We are explicitly political. We are radical, and I'll talk about that as well. And we're fighting for the abolition of the prison industrial complex with an intersectional approach. And we believe that that starts with pretrial detention. We also are fighting for decrim and reparations. So movement lawyering is defined as lawyering that supports and advances social movements, defined as the building and exercise of collective power led by the most directly impacted to achieve systemic, institutional, and cultural change. And so movement lawyers, unlike other lawyers, kind of don't just operate at the kind of the centers of power, but often try to use those skills to help build community organizations' power. And that's because we believe that change happens when folks who are most directly impacted organize themselves and make demands. That we don't think change happens because you win a Supreme Court lawsuit. We don't think change happens just because you operate in the kind of areas of power. We think that change has to come from the bottom up. And so the question becomes, how can you as a lawyer use your skills to open up more space for movement to operate power? And the reason why I think we embrace organizing, and this is from Ella Baker, who is one of my favorite sheroes. She's an incredible organizer, really behind the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, behind the NAACP. She's a woman who was behind most movements in the 1930s through 70s and is an incredible leader. And she, I think, really verses us in why organizing, why actually supporting power building is so important. And she says organizing directly impacted communities is morally right because the oppressed have the right to determine the nature of the struggle against oppression. It is strategic because those closest to the problem and experience the consequences of the struggle should determine the direction of the struggle. And it is sustainable because ordinary people must understand their own power so they can take on future problems. I think, we really believe that there isn't a single movement from the end of slavery to the civil rights movement, to the unionization movement that isn't actually fueled by those folks who are most impacted. We think if you are closest to the problem, you are closest to the solution, and it's only sustainable if we really support the power of the folks who are most impacted. We also say that we are radical, and I think radical has been a word that has been weaponized against the left in many ways and is used by the right in really problematic ways. But we define radical also based on Ella Baker's definition. And she says, in order for us poor and oppressed people to become part of a society that is meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. This means that we are going to have to learn to think in radical terms. I use the term radical in its original meaning, that is getting down to and understanding the root cause of things. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you can change that system. And so what we often take from this quote is this idea of getting down to the original cause of things. That we understand police killings are not caused by bad police officers. They're caused by a system of policing based on racism that sends police to Black neighborhoods with violence and no accountability. And so how do we kind of break through what we see as symptomatic and symptoms into the actual root causes of things? And for us, we identify racism, sexism, and capitalism as the three kind of key root causes that really animate the inequalities that Black folks, brown folks, and poor folks see in this country. This is another quote about radicalism from MLK, who has been really kind of in the mainstream media, has been de-radicalized. But in fact, MLK was a radical figure who was calling for really not only the kind of end of the war in Vietnam, not only the end of racism in the South, but also for a rethinking of capitalism in some fundamental ways. And of course, he's been sanitized, I think, by the neoliberals and by the right, because even now, like Trump talks about MLK, so you know that that's not really who he was. But he said, in these trying circumstances, the Black revolution is much more than a struggle for the rights of Negroes. It is forcing America to face all of its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, materialism. It is exposing the evils that are rooted deeply in the whole structure of our society. It reveals systemic rather than superficial flaws and suggests that a radical reconstruction of society itself is the real issue to be faced. And so when he says materialism and poverty, he's talking about capitalism. And the militarism, of course, is a reference to Vietnam in that moment, but also all the ways in which we have materialized or militarized, not just overseas, but also here in the US. And that really was beginning under MLK in the 60s and 70s. We were seeing trillions of dollars being poured into local law enforcement. The last kind of political philosophy that I'll talk about before I go into the Free Black Mamas bailout walk is intersectionality of Black queer feminism. And intersectionality of Black queer feminism is an idea that really takes root in the same time period as second wave feminism, but is really led by Black women, often Black lesbian or queer women. And the Combie River Collective is, I think, an incredible example of this. The Combie River Collective was a Black feminist lesbian organization that was founded in 1974 in Boston. And the collective argued that both the white feminist movement on one hand and the civil rights movement on the other hand were abandoning and neglecting the needs and the experiences of Black queer women. That in the civil rights movement, there was a total ignoring of Black women generally and Black queer women specifically. And then meanwhile, the kind of mainstream white feminist movement really acted as if Black women and their needs didn't exist. That the kind of the spectrum of struggle, the terrain on which the white feminists fought was so unrelated, I think, to the struggles of Black women at that time period, that they felt left behind and abandoned by both of those struggles. And so they have an incredible, y'all should read it if you haven't, an incredible statement that they wrote about the importance of looking at the kind of intersections of Blackness, of queerness, and of womanhood to really understand what freedom could be, what liberation is in all of these fronts. And they wrote, if Black women were free, it would mean that everybody else would have to be free, since all freedom would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. And the idea being that when you think about just women's liberation or just Black liberation or even just queer liberation, that somebody is left behind. And if you look at folks who are most marginalized in all those different ways, who wear all those identities, who are both Black, who are queer, who are also women, if you solve for them, then in some ways more people get free, right? And so you don't have an exclusionary vision of what freedom could look like. I think a more academic analysis that kind of makes the same point is Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality in 1989. And she said that it really describes the simultaneous impacts of racism, sexism, capitalism, anti-queerness, and homophobia on Black women. And so that is to say that as a Black woman, I don't just experience the award as a Black person, I also experience it as a woman. And so all of the ways in which sexism is harmful, I experience that, but I also experience the ways that racism is harmful. And if I was queer, I would also experience the way that the anti-homophobia or homophobia and anti-queerness articulate themselves. And so the idea is that you can't just live a single identity, that you are not just one kind of person, that in fact, all these different identities intersect and they compound oppression, right? And so you're vulnerable both to racism and to sexism and to patriarchy and to homophobia, and those compound in your experience. And so if we are solving a problem of, for instance, patriarchy, we have to also address racism, because Black women understand and experience those both simultaneously. You can't actually divide them out. And Black queer feminism, I think, is even a new approach. And this is my favorite picture. This is a picture of Audre Lorde, and if you guys can't read it, the Blackboard reads, "Women are powerful and dangerous." And this really was Audre Lorde, hopefully y'all know, is an incredible writer and thinker who really, I think, embodies the beginning of Black queer feminism. Let me go back a slide. Ooh, there we go. So Black queer feminism, which has become increasingly popular and is the politic that we identify with, is really building on both the Combie River Collective work that again says kind of mainstream feminism, mainstream civil rights excludes Black women, that we are caught in the kind of the intersection, and therefore neither movement actually addresses us. So it's a combination of that with intersectionality, and brings in it brings in queer theory. And so the idea that throughout, whether it's trans women who are constantly being criminalized and now being killed across the country and the world, whether it's queer folks who are non-gender conforming, that there are also ways that these systems are specifically abusive and oppressive of those folks. And so how do we have an analysis that actually doesn't leave any woman behind, that says, if you are a Black trans woman, our liberation movement is also for you. That the gains that we get, whether they're gains in employment, whether they're gains in kind of the home front, these are gains that will also benefit you. And the problem, I think, and the critique is that so often the feminist movement and the civil rights movement has left out Black and queer women. And so the gains that are made are not made on their behalf. And so Black queer feminism is a combination of kind of those areas of thought and thinking. BYP 100 has been a leader in this. And essentially it's a set of approaches to thought, expression, and political action that critiques the structures of racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, and other forms of oppression. And so really the idea is, again, you can't just address patriarchy. You have to address all of the ways in which patriarchy is connected to classism, it's connected to racism. And that these oppressions, these isms, fuel each other in basic ways. I think a lot of our work is also in response to and in rejection to cost-worth feminism. And so this is a quote from Victoria Law. Cost-worth feminism describes an approach that sees increased policing of prosecution and imprisonment as the primary solution to violence against women. This stance does not acknowledge that police are often purveyors of violence and that prisons are always sites of violence. Cost-worth feminism ignores the ways in which race, class, gender identity, and immigration status leave certain women more vulnerable to violence, and that greater criminalization often places these same women at risk of state violence. And so again, cost-worth feminism, I think, was a real kind of solution of the white feminist movement, is that if we just got more police to deal with domestic violence, for instance, we would all be safer. But the reality is that Black women are also criminalized by police. They also end up in cages because of police involvement. And so an idea of focus just on what's best for middle-class white women will leave behind, but also injure and harm Black women, brown women, and poor women. So I'm gonna actually skip through the abolition of bit. So we're also abolitionists. What this means is that we believe in a gradual project of decarceration. We don't think that cages, that prison cells, that police keep our people safe. We think we have to do the really hard and difficult work of thinking through other ways to deal with harm. And this, I'll just say quickly, there was a recent survey of survivors, of folks who have been through the criminal legal system, who survived rape, robbery, and serious violent crime. And over 75% said they don't think this iteration of criminal justice serves them at all, that they were not actually in any way repaid by the prosecution and the incarceration of the person who harmed them. There was absolutely no redress for them personally. They didn't receive any kind of support through this system. And so I think just to say that this system actually doesn't serve either the folks who are locked in cages or the folks who have to survive violence, it doesn't deal with the underlying causes of violence. It is a system of punishment for Black and brown people. And so we believe that it's not effective, and we think that it has to be abolished. And I think, as we also do reparations, I'll move past that because I think I'm short on time. But want to talk a bit about the work that we do as part of the National Bailout Collective. And so, as I said, Law for Black Lives is an organization that works with movement lawyers. We support the building out of local power building. We also incubate projects. And so we really work to support the building of power with different kind of projects. One of those projects is the National Bailout Collective. And this is, we call it #FreeBlackMamas. It was founded in 2017 by a group of Black folks. This is the original group of people who came together to found the National Bailout Collective, who saw the ways that bail reform across the country was leaving Black folks behind via risk assessment. And shout out to California that just voted down Prop 25, which really embraced risk assessments. But we were watching as in our name, in Black people's name, bail reform was happening, but very often wasn't actually addressing the ways that Black folks were locked up at higher rates, wasn't addressing the ways that Black women had to survive this system. And so we wanted to make an intervention. And Mary Hooks, who you will see on the, I think it will be your right side, sitting down with dreadlocks, suggested, she said, what would happen if we just bailed out our people? If on Mother's Day, we just went back and got all of the Black women who were locked up and bailed them out? Like, what would that be? What statement could we make for our folks? And so that was the suggestion. It was part of a much larger strategy of policy reform, of research, and of leadership development. And so it included not only the funding and support of over 20 organizations across the country who are doing bail reform, it also included research around best policies that support our people. It included a fellowship where about 55 of the mamas we've bailed out have been in a one-year fellowship to develop the leadership skills. And now today, those are the people who bail out our folks. And so really, it's been about building the power of the folks who have been inside these cages. It was based on the reality that most criminal legal reform left behind Black and queer women. And it was not just about paying bail. As I said, it was also about leadership development, political education, and more. And it was explicitly and unapologetically political. There we go. Oh. The National Bail Collective, again, consists of about 20 different groups across the country, and we have collectively bailed out more than 400 people. Most of those folks are Black mothers and caregivers. We provided supportive services to over 80% of those folks. That has ranged from a MetroCard home to rent for up to 6 months, to job training, to drug treatment. We've helped groups in Los Angeles, New York, Georgia, New Orleans, Philadelphia, and beyond build power and end money bail and build up supportive services. What we found and what we already knew was that most folks when they get out of jail or prison have absolutely no support, that our social safety net has been completely decimated. And so folks come out and literally have no place to go, have no home, have no job training, don't even have a meal. And so a lot of our work was, how do we actually bridge that gap? How do we provide for our people? How do we make sure that our folks have what they need to actually get back on their feet? And together we raised over $10 million from over 50,000 people. And this, I think, is amazing. There's this amazing story that, that Mary Hooks tells. You know, every single organization has to do their own fundraising. We also do national fundraising. But folks will go into car washes or door knocking, this is before COVID, to ask for money for these bailouts. And there was a homeless woman in front of a wash house, in front of a laundromat in Atlanta, who heard about the bailouts and said, I want to help, and went through all of her bags and found $1 to give to Mary Hooks and song. And the idea of that is that all people, no matter how kind of downtrodden they are, feel connected and committed to this idea and this mission of bailing out our folks and are looking for the last dollar to do that. And so we are so proud of the fact that 50,000 people, many of whom are not millionaires, many of whom don't have that much money, gave small donations to get mamas out of jail on Mother's Day. And the whole premise was all people do not belong in jail. And I think we don't believe anyone belongs in jail, but the reality is that Black women are the last ones people come for. And so we want to be really, really clear that we want to support kind of the folks who are most marginalized. So we looked for Black mamas and Black trans folks who we know had the least support and were the least likely to get bailed out. And part of that reason is because Black women are the backbone of Black communities. And so when they are in jail, there's very often no one left to come get them. We have learned a lot from these bailouts, and one of the things I think that is most shocking, although often not surprising, and really sad and depressing, is just it shows all the ways that this system has destroyed families because of very, 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 very silly things, because of things like poverty crimes. We had a woman out of Los Angeles who had lost her job and was living in her car with her 2 children, and was maintaining, was going every day, taking her kids to school, trying to get unemployment checks, but could not pay the rent in her house, despite, I think, also working part-time jobs and part-time gigs. And so she was arrested because she was trespassing because her car was parked in a parking lot at Best Buy's, and the police came and arrested her. And during that arrest, she was awoken kind of very surprised with a knock on the door, and was very shocked and was belligerent, was like, please leave me and my kids alone. The police charged her with assault of a police officer, and she had a $500,000 bailing in Los Angeles. And this, again, is just because she couldn't feed her kids. She was, again, homeless in a parking lot because she lost her job. And so we see all the ways that because the housing system failed her, because the employment system failed her, she's now being criminalized. And that happens, that's a unique, I think, for especially Black women and Black people, that they are criminalized because of poverty. And that's not an accident. There's a series of laws passed in the 80s and 90s that really criminalized poverty, but we saw a lot of our women were locked up because of poverty crimes. People were also charged with identity-based charges. And so trans women especially, there's a law here in New York that if you are a trans woman who has a condom in your pocket, there's an assumption that you are doing sex work. And so you can be charged with prostitution and solicitation just by virtue of the condom. I mean, that's not unique to New York City. We had a woman here in New York that we bailed out who was arrested because of a condom in her bag. And she, of course, was a trans woman who was targeted because she was trans. We also saw over and over again that people would come out of jail and literally the state, which spends sometimes up to $200 a night to lock folks in a cage, provided absolutely no support for folks when they got out. Nothing, not a meal, not a MetroCard home. We had folks who were stuck at the jail or the prison they were let out of because there was no bus that would pick them up at midnight, and often jails release folks between 11 and 3 a.m. in ways that also honestly lead to sexual abuse and violence of women who are let out during that time. And so literally this system is so kind of vicious against the folks who it ensnares in its hooks. And for Black women and Black trans women especially, there was really no other support system that holds them except for their people. And if anything, we saw over and over again, the system trying to reincarcerate folks via surveillance, via ankle monitors, and really isolated folks in ways that made it impossible for folks to heal if they were dealing with trauma. And we know that folks are dealing with trauma. Over 86% of all women who are locked up in jail have survived sexual and physical abuse. 86%. Over 80% of women in jail are the primary caregivers of children under 18. And so we know when you lock up women, when you lock up trans women, you are locking up an entire community of folks, and you are really kind of taking the backbone out of these communities. And so we wanted to figure out, how do we not only support bailing them out, but also provide a kind of a pipeline of leadership. And so we developed the Free Black Mamas Fellowship, which is a 1-year fellowship that paid a living wage to over 45 of the mamas we bailed out and taught them political advocacy skills. And so now they are advocating for the end of money bail in Atlanta, Los Angeles, in New Orleans, in New York City, and in Philadelphia. And so we believe a holistic approach has to be taken that doesn't just address the symptom of incarceration, but how do we actually make sure our folks are employed, that their children are taken care of. It includes child support and child care for folks who have to walk. How do we address the whole kind of the intersections of all the systems that are failing Black women and Black trans women? As I said, the National Bail is abolitionist. It understands this effort as a continuation of ending slavery. And so we often say that slavery was not ended, that the abolitionist efforts of the 1800s did not end with the end of slavery, that the 13th Amendment allowed for a loophole in slavery that allowed for incarceration of people. And because of that, we've seen a huge increase, a massive increase of the incarceration of Black and brown people, especially Black people in this country. And we see that as the afterlife of slavery. And so we are fighting for that. We see our abolitionist struggle as a continuation of the struggle of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and others who were radically demanding a complete new system that did not use slave labor at the center of it, and we're demanding a system that doesn't include the prison industrial complex, which really has seeped into almost every single industry in this country. And so we often say, until we abolish bail and mass incarceration, we will free ourselves. And so it is often Black folks freeing Black folks with the support of white folks and allies across the country. And so we have seen donations, we have seen white folks and other folks stand up and support these efforts in valiant ways. And we don't think we get free unless we are in deep collaboration with each other. And then last, the national bailout really is the manifestation of the rejection of cultural feminism. Most of all women who we bailed out are the victims and survivors of domestic abuse. And we don't think, and they don't think, that jail makes them safer. And often they are arrested because of domestic abuse because they're in situations. Well, the reality is that our systems, when they go to arrest somebody or when a DV is caught in, when it's in a Black neighborhood or a Black home, they arrest both the woman and the man for that. And so we see the criminalization of Black women happens because of the demand of the only solution to harm is the police state. And the reality is that for Black folks, the police state is always harmful. And so they have experienced kind of compounding harms of domestic violence at home and then the brutality of police on top of that. And so our movement is calling for an addressing of the harm that women face, but not through the carceral state, not through the police, not through cages. These are things that recreate harm, that do further harm. And so we are really demanding an imaginative and bold approach that accounts for the harm and thinks of new ways of solving it and doesn't rely on the same carceral state that has been animated, quite frankly, by racism from its very beginning. Many of the women that we bail out live at the margins of race and gender and poverty, and we are working to build structures that really hold our people when they're harmed. And so it's not that abolition or Black queer feminism denies the fact that people, that gender violence exists, that it's rampant. It just says that the carceral state, the prisons and jails and police have never solved that for anyone except for white women, not even for them, I don't think. And therefore, we must address that harm in a more systemic way that doesn't rely on these structures that are literally killing our people. And so that is my presentation, and I hope y'all enjoyed it. I hope that the introduction was really to the work of National Bailout and the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think is building power across the country to change the terrain of capitalism, of racism, and of patriarchy in this country. And so I appreciate y'all listening. I don't know if we have time, I'm sure we don't, for questions or thoughts, but happy to answer them. Also, we'll share my email if folks want to talk more. And I'll stop sharing my screen one sec.
Thanks, Maubrey. Stay on for a minute because there's a couple of questions that have come through on the chat, and I'm wondering if you can answer those for me. One of them from Catherine Brown is, in what ways can white women in our community here in Redlands area be helpful in moving against racism? And be kind of specific if you can.
Yeah, I mean, so there's incredible work actually happening in California. There's a group called SE Justice Group, which is a group that I think has a chapter in the Inland Empire. And they are women who work with women who have incarcerated loved ones and just do incredible work to support that. They also are behind the bail reform. And so I say that to say, I think join an organization, like be part of support, not just financially, but find other ways to support local organizing efforts. I also think, and this election is, I think, an example of this, it's important that all of us are politicizing and talking to our people, and whether that's family members, whoever, and moving them towards a different kind of politic and reckoning really with the ways in which racism and gender violence are intersecting and harming people. And so I think doing your part to educate yourselves and those around you, it means a lot. And it's really important. But I would also recommend looking up organizations like SE Justice Group that's doing incredible work very close to you and figuring out how you can kind of put your hands in the soil where you stand.
Okay, and one more question from Catherine says, in your view, in what ways, short of replacement with some other system like the socialist system, can our capitalist system be adjusted to improve the current circumstances?
That's a good question. So I think there's a lot of examples out of kind of Western Europe, and interestingly, in populations that tend to be more like monogamous, tend to be more all white. There's a democratic kind of socialism that still is based on capitalism. It still has private property. It still allows for the growth of private property, but really has a very, very, very robust social service state. And so I think, I think whether it's Medicare for all, whether it's even some of the policies of Joe Biden, but certainly the policies of Bernie Sanders, moves us towards that. That isn't ending capitalism. It is supplementing the capitalist state with some real social safety nets. And I would argue that this kind of the U.S. state of the 1960s was moving towards that as well. I am a socialist. I think that ultimately for us to end, capitalism is inherently built on the oppression of some labor for the gain of other labor. I think that for us to really abolish patriarchy, to abolish racism, to abolish classism, we're gonna have to abolish capitalism. I think that is a slow fight, and I will be here for some of it and not all of it. But I think in the meantime, democratic socialism moves us towards a capitalist state that at least it was a compassionate capitalism, I think was the kind of the Bush scenario. And I don't believe in that, but I do think there are different ways that we can build up a social safety net that take care of our people in the meantime.
Okay. Priya says, this was so powerful, thank you. And Ellen Grunbaum says, we need to challenge the old messages that suggest poverty is due to laziness or whatever, and to see the real forces at work that keep people poor and how society has put the idea of putting people in jail. So getting people out of jail is clearly not enough. So have you got any, I know you sent me a website that has an article on it that you said would be good reading for everybody. And yeah. I will send that on to all of our members so that they can see it and they can look at it too.
And I think there's some other readings I can suggest too. I can make a short kind of reading list. There are some incredible writers, I think. Charlene Carruthers is someone who writes about kind of Black queer feminism. Yamada Kienga Taylor is an incredible writer and theorist about kind of the politics of this moment. So I think there's a lot of folks, and I would just agree with Ellen completely. I think, and it's not, I think that the narratives around Black laziness actually, like, they originate in slavery. And so we saw in this country the move from indentured servitude that included white labor, like Irish folks and other folks, to slavery was also about this cultural shift that named Black folks as lazy. And so the way to justify slavery, because it clearly was so unjustifiable, was to make Black folks a different kind of person that included them being lazy, promiscuous. And so there's a whole like all of these kind of tropes about Blackness that really began with the use of slavery that we can see so clearly in the criminal legal system. And so there's still these, and also in the rejection of like the welfare state. And so there was, I think the neoliberals used this idea of like the lazy Black woman and the welfare queen, which was just a total mythology, to justify the end of public assistance for Black people and all people, because as we know, public assistance actually mostly is available for white folks because white folks are the majority of the country. But despite that, use those narratives to destroy systems that benefit all of us. And so I think it's really important to name the ways in which these tropes have been weaponized by the right to really destroy really like progressive ideas that ultimately benefit all poor people, not just Black people. Yes, the system that's better than money bail is not putting people in jail that committed no crime. And so we really, the reality is that almost everybody who gets locked up on money bail is there for offenses that are low-level offenses. And, we have a system that says it presumes innocence until you're proven guilty, but the reality is money bail completely turns it on its head. And money bail is used to keep folks hostage. It's because our system processes so many people, it forces plea bargains out of 98% of people, and money bail is meant to hold folks hostage so they agree to a plea bargain. And so if we arrested less people, processed less people, we would not have to use money bail for the folks who I think folks think are a danger to society. The reality is there are other ways to monitor those folks. Almost nobody leaves. Almost everybody comes back for their trials, over 98% of folks. And so we don't need a way to keep people locked up. And money doesn't help. What helps is like Metro cards. Like here in New York, we found the most effective way to get folks back to court was a phone call reminder, the offering of childcare, and transportation, right? And so the reality is, for instance, if you have a court date at 10 o'clock and you have a job at a retail store that you will lose because of that court date, you don't have enough money to get a ride, and you have kids to take care of, there are lots of reasons not to come to court. And so I think we have to accommodate those realities in ways that I think make more sense.
That was the question that I had, is because there was a proposition on the ballot this time around to do away with the money bail system, but I was confused because the NAACP was opposed to it.
Yeah. So that proposition, and I can also, there's a lot of articles I can share on this, and this is just from folks that are in California because I don't vote in Cali anymore. But my understanding is that proposition relied on risk assessment, and risk assessment is this idea. It's a kind of computer mathematic algorithm that weighs a series of factors, including things like, do you have a criminal record? Even things like, did you finish high school? Like, what zip code do you live in? So it assumes criminality based on your past criminal interactions with the system. And the reality is that it uses racist data, and therefore the results are racist. So under risk assessment, more Black folks are held than white folks because it uses these data points that are so systemically racist that it's inevitable that you think Black folks are more risky. So you ask something like, oh, do you have a job? But you know that in fact, Black unemployment is twice that of white unemployment as a factor to use to determine if you should be free or not. Of course, it's going to be racist. And so the real pushback from NAACP and organizers was this idea that you can't use this system data. If we know our system is racist and broken and flawed, we can't use that data to then determine outcomes in a new system, right? Because it's already flawed. And secondly, the judges had full discretion, and there's a lot of nonsense with the judges in California. There's like a whole thing, like all the judges like were black-faced 20 years ago. They're just problematic judges in lots of ways. And so there was a big pushback against algorithms, but I think the end of money bail doesn't have to include algorithms. It can also just include letting most folks go and providing support systems for folks so that we can make sure that they get back to court if they need to. And more than that, we can move money from this system that literally spends trillions of dollars for low-level offenses to actually make sure folks have jobs, make sure folks have housing. That most folks who are in the criminal legal system are in there because of addiction or poverty. They're in there because of things like trespassing, things like low-level theft, things like solicitation. All of these things are poverty crimes. They're crimes that people engage in because they don't have homes or jobs or incomes or wages or support for their children. And so I think it's just really, or because they have a disease and they need help. And so I think it's just really important that we, and LA is doing this in incredible ways, that we start taking money out of this system that has set up the jail and the courts and police as the only solution to all social ills, whether it is gender-based harm, whether it is drug addiction, whether it's mental health issues. We have like sucked money out of every other system and poured it into this one system that criminalizes people. And so I think the work of starting to dismantle that system and put money back into all these other systems, whether it's healthcare, education, employment, is so, so important. And it's the mandate of this moment.
I love your explanations there. So it's too bad that we're in this kind of a meeting and you cannot hear the applause, but we all appreciate you coming and talking to us. It was a great, great presentation. So thank you, thank you. And you can stay if you want, but we're going to have a short business meeting now for our AAUW group. So thank you for coming, and we really appreciate it. And
was
send
such a
me those articles if you want to, and I'll pass them on to our members.
I will. Very good. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right, let's move on now with our business meeting. First of all, let me do the November birthdays first. So I'm going to share my screen here so that you can see the November birthdays. Here we go. There we go. November birthdays. Mary Blickensderfer, Shelley Bodner, Jane Henry, Sandy Meath Rask, Kate Pretorius, Marilyn Shankar, Nina Spangrud, B. Yancey, and Sue Young. It's kind of hard for us to sing happy birthday to everybody, but we did also get a chance to say happy birthday to Mary Jane Aubacher earlier in our social gathering because she was there in the social gathering to talk to us, and she celebrated 98 years this year. So happy birthday to all of our November birthday ladies, and hope you have a wonderful year. All right, let me move on now to, we need to take a look at and approve the